Thank you very much. Thank you for coming again. I dedicated the two first lectures, perhaps it was too long, just for telling you a story of a case. Finally, this night, this afternoon, I can ask a question about this story. The question is, how do we inherit from this story? I begin with the point of view of the fool or of children. You know, there is a story, famous story about a child who sees an orchestra in the street, and the music at a certain moment stops, and the child asks, "Now, where is the music? Where is it?" So I ask the same childish question. Once the uprising in the Warsaw ghetto had been crushed in May 1943. Once the entire area had been burnt and leveled to the ground. When all the insurgents or quite were killed. Now my question, where has all their courage gone? Where? I begin to just a very, very weak hypothesis, a faraway whisper, which first comes to my mind. It's a song, it's a poem, once again. It's rising into the air like wisps of white smoke from the rubble. It's the poem by Itzhak Katzenelson. These are books by him, which were read in the Warsaw ghetto. And this is the edition, the French one, of his great poem, written in October 1943, Song of the Murdered Jewish People. Okay. Shout out from the sand, from under every stone, from all the dust. Shout out loud, from the flames, from all the smoke. Show yourselves. Come before my eyes. Come, all of you. Come. I want to see you all. I want to look at you. And it's a very, very long poem. End of quotation. If hope, if I read correctly, if hope of any kind can still be sensed when reading such a desperate text, this could only be due to the appearance of a particular hypothesis underlying, either guiding such a poetic lament. This is the idea that the dead are still able to cry out to the world or in the world of the survivors. They would have the potency to reach into our memories as long as we are willing to listen. Of course, we must will to listen. The strength of memory is able to hold a powerless community together, such has been the case of the Jewish people during a long course of history, ever since the biblical phrase Zachor, remember. in his wonderful book, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, Yosef Yerushalmi took as his starting point the fundamental role played by memory as distinct from history per se, the latter understood as humankind's circumstantial and documented process of becoming. Memory is different. I quote Yerushalmi. In the many trials Jews endured, their memory of the past was always essential. Why are historians not the primary depositories of this memory? For these are the facts. Never did rabbis write the history of what occurred after the Bible. Perhaps they already knew everything they needed to know about history. Perhaps they even fostered a certain mistrust of history. It would seem that only the story told by the Bible can, when taken as a whole, bestow meaning on all the historical contingencies of the future. End of quote. Most usefully, Yerushalmi reminds us that the modern Jewish thought before Second World War practiced a constant critique of historicism. It did this by refusing to grant any unilateral trust in positive or positivistic powers of historical reasoning. This critical attitude can be seen most egregiously in Franz Rosenzweig's work, The Star of Redemption. Strangely enough, Yerushalmi fails to mention that during the exact same period of time, Walter Benjamin had a different way of describing the dialectics of memory and history, as can best be seen in the latter's famous testimonial text written in 1940 on the concept of history. On the one hand, says Benjamin, there is, I quote, a secret agreement between generations of the past and our own. End of quote. He means a protocol of meeting, possibly belonging to the typical form of memory present in Jewish tradition, including even Kabbalistic memory, if we consider the intellectual friendship that so closely linked Benjamin with Gershom Scholem, for example. And this is why, says Benjamin, the past carries a secret index with it by which it is referred to its resurrection or redemption, which is a theological concept, of course. Second, on the other hand, Benjamin indeed appeals to materialist history. He does not forget history. This is according to another intellectual bond that joins him in friendship, this time with Ernst Bloch, Bertolt Brecht, for example. Here we see the necessity to practice historical thinking by taking the singular nature of each material document into account, just as Emanuel Ringelblum advocated during the time in the ghetto, as well as the structural movements that are discernible across long time, as Marc Bloch advocated, or Aby Warburg, and in addition, the tensions expressed by our imaginary world as taught by Siegfried Krakauer, another friend. Such a way of practicing history, materialistic, is recognizable in Benjamin's political statement, which is also a political courage. The struggling, the oppressed class itself is the depository of historical knowledge. Das Subjekt historischer Erkenntnis ist die kämpfende, unterdrückte Klasse selbst. It is then possible to ask what the secret agreement between the past generation, those of the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, could have with our own. This is my question. Asked in another way, the question becomes, what exactly would this struggling, oppressed class, and Benjamin says also the Namenlosen, wonderful expression, be those from whom we could inherit such courage? How to inherit courage from the Namenlosen of Warsaw Ghetto? Unfortunately, the answer to these questions is anything but simple, for the simple reason that history, like memory, is itself a veritable battlefield. You have a beautiful book by Enzo Traverso, History as a Battlefield. Almost all the fighters of the ghetto died with their backs to the wall, especially Mordecai Anielewicz, especially because he was the commander of the Jewish Combat Organization. Mordecai Anielewicz killed himself in his bunker on May 8, 1943. I repeat what I said yesterday, he was barely 24 years old. Along with his fellow commanders, friends, rather than being taken prisoner by the Nazis, we also know that between 15 and 20 fighters managed to escape through the network of sewers. In other words, they survived beyond the confines of the wall, beyond the surface of the city, surrounding the walls surrounding the ghetto. Foremost amongst these survivors, I can cite Marek Edelman. Marek Edelman, I repeat what I said yesterday, just 24 years of age, who was named leader of the insurrection after Anielewicz's death. We should not forget, however, that even when people are fighting with their backs onto the wall, the struggle is not exactly with a single enemy, with an identifiable enemy. Indeed, this is terrible to say, but indeed, the uprising, the resistance, it was the same in France, for example, the French resistance. The resistance against the main enemy was also a tragic field of tensions, if not to say a tragic battlefield amongst the insurrectionists themselves. Thus, the same divisions that fragmented the struggle from the inside, and I mean specifically the differences between, on one hand, Bundists and Zionist socialists, left-wing, and right-wing revisionist Zionist on the other hand. So these divisions that fragmented the struggle from the inside will all later resurface when, after the war, people began to ask what exactly the Warsaw Battle's legacy should be. Legacy is itself a battlefield. In other words, what exactly would remain of all that courage? And here, the battle, symbolic one, of course, begins. I give you just 2 or 3 examples, not more. The first example is the one of Hillel Seidman. Hillel Seidman left the ghetto just before the insurrection. He was not an insurrectioner, but he wrote an extraordinary chronicle of daily life in the ghetto, with all the details, but everything from the point of view of a religious man, and also that of a fervent Zionist. For example, he totally mistrusts the Polish resistance, the Polish left, and he considers in the same context that the Bundists are simply naive persons. In his writing, he merely mentions in passing, quite nothing, the Emanuel Ringelblum's clandestine work of establishing the ghetto's historical archives. He's not interested in this. After the war, Hillel Seidman will write a lively biography of Menahem Begin. You see here, he received a prize from the hands of Menahem Begin, the right-wing Prime Minister of Israel, in which he will vehemently criticize the actions taken by the United Nations vis-à-vis the State of Israel, whose political and military choices he will always defend. There is a paradox in Seidman's text. In 1945-46, when he wrote his chronicle, he was well aware that, I quote, faith in the mystical eternity of Jewish existence, as well as in the perennial existence of Israel, had indeed been a factor contributing to the non-mobilization of Jews in the ghetto. And it was, therefore, this feeling of being eternal was catastrophic, politically catastrophic. But the same Hillel Seidman will also spend the rest of his life defending this very eternity. In the final entry of his ghetto diary, March 15 of 1943, his writing is dominated by the following words taken from a rabbi, I quote, "And if God Almighty has thus decreed, then we shall all perish together. Thanks to God." Another example is provided by Gideon Hausner, a very important character in Israeli history. Gideon Hausner was born in 1915 in Poland, but immigrated to Palestine in 1927. So he did not experience the Nazi situation. He studied philosophy and law in Jerusalem. In 1948, he fought as a member of the Haganah, the paramilitary Zionist organization. As such, he had not experienced the persecution in Europe, and he's best known, it is the photograph on the right, for his role as prosecutor appointed by Israel State for the Eichmann trial of 1961. And in her book, Hannah Arendt is very, very, very hard against this guy. From 1965 to 1981, he was a member of the Knesset, as well as president. He was the president of the board of trustees for the Yad Vashem Memorial. This is crucial for us, because this is about a politics of memory. On April 25 of 1968, he delivered a very important speech during a special session of the Israeli parliament, marking the 25th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It is almost as though the ghetto insurgents were being officially inducted into the founding and unifying myth of the State of Israel. Masada, Warsaw, so to speak. Actually, Hausner begins evoking the ancient memory of Masada, that is the collective suicide of Jewish insurgents who had risen up against the imperial power of Rome. Hausner writes, "We shall not fall alive into enemy hands," he writes, thus suggesting a continuous line, eternal line, linking this ancient past, which is, by the way, profoundly mythified. There are a lot of historical deconstruction of such a history, and the history of the ghetto Warsaw and the present day, 1968, in Israel. 1968, 1 year after the victory and when Israeli army was able to take the Wailing Wall. Hausner concludes in the following way, and I quote from the English version, the discourse was published also in English. "The ghetto rebels have bestowed an eternal duty," I underline eternal, "on us, that of solidifying their victory and of ensuring eternal life," let us underline eternal life, "for the Jewish people. This is their legacy, and we shall forever cherish this inheritance." It's easy to conclude briefly, if my analysis is very short, but to conclude that there is a kind of officialization and mythification of the role of the Warsaw Ghetto insurrection between Masada and the recent victories of Israeli army. Against such accounts, a Bundist such as Marek Edelman, I spoke about him already, could not help but roll out a diametrically opposed point of view. Despite having the moral authority of someone who had actively taken part in the uprising, even being the commander, Edelman affirms in all his discourses that, I quote, "he does not have the right to speak in the name of his comrades who had fallen in combat. It is by random chance that I am still here," he confessed in a commemorative speech given in 2005. He did not offer up his memories of the struggle as though they were etched in stone. No, it was only a series of what he called broken pieces of memory. Nonetheless, he remained adamant, very strict, concerning one principle. And by the way, this principle is shared by Hannah Arendt. He said, "Evil is not Nazi. Evil is human." It's different. It can take, therefore, on many faces, and it is our responsibility, he says, to learn how to recognize those faces each time one appears. For him, the legacy of such uprising, we must pass on of the Warsaw Uprising lies precisely in this responsibility of recognizing the face of evil, the human face of evil. When in 1995 he was invited to speak during a conference, the title was Polish Memory, Jewish Memory, Edelman reiterated his conviction concerning the multiplicity of memories, even in the context of Jewish history. He said, "There is no such thing as a monolithic national framework of this memory. Such a view takes aim at every form of memorial nationalism," which he rejected, whether it be in Israel or in Poland. The question of memory, he says, is first of all a question of politics. He was fully aware that his own courage of the past had now become the locus of a veritable conflict of legacies, a political conflict of legacies. This is why, whenever he was asked to recall his heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto, he always responded by speaking about the situation of the current day. He spoke on Cambodia, Vietnam, Biafra, Rwanda, and given that his own struggle was part of his youth as a member of the Bund, he was also extremely sympathetic to the youth rebellions he had seen in 1968 in Europe. As always within his political purview, including the way he saw the ghetto, Marek Edelman looked forward a unionist utopia, unionist and cosmopolite and internationalist utopia. He did not dream of a national utopia, such as the one advocated by Hillel Seidman. And it's the reason that after the war, despite the pogroms of 1946 in Poland, he remained all his life in Warsaw, in Poland. He was a founding member of the union, the syndicat, Solidarność, not by chance. And he reiterated this position based on an anti-statism, going so far as to provoke a scandal in Israel when he called the stone throwers of the first Intifada in 1987 partisans, combatants, rather than terrorists. If, finally, Claude Lanzmann declined to include Edelman testimony in his film Shoah, to be correct, Edelman was the most important survivor to make a testimony. But his anti-nationalistic and his anti-Zionist outlook continued to inspire the thinking of the old insurgent, and therefore it was not correct for the film of Lanzmann. It's, I think, the reason he does not appear in this film. Edelman lived long enough to express his anger, terrible anger, when he heard these words. It's an example amongst many of a Tzahal officer published in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on January 25th of 2002. I quote the Israeli officer. He says, "It is justified and even essential to draw our conclusions from as many sources as possible if our mission is to take over a densely populated refugee camp or to capture the Nablus Kasbah, and if the duty of the commander includes the obligation to try to accomplish this mission without creating victims," just underlining this, without creating victims on either side, then this commander must then this commander must first study and integrate the lessons to be learned from the past battles, and even, however shocking this may seem, to study the ways in which the German army conducted itself in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is quite incredible to have this statement, especially if the mission is to create no victims. Okay. So we see how Edelman's legitimate anger could lead him, despite he was a very close friend to the two characters I showed you yesterday, Zuckerman and Rotem. He went to Israel, but he litigated a lot. But he said, in Israel, we risk erasing our own memory when we rely on memory professionals who instrumentalize our memory for political gain. Memory is always instrumentalized. Memory is always manipulated. Of course, it is a plastic material. So we confront a big problem. What is to inherit it from this courage? I come back to the beginning. Indeed, the idea of a legacy or inheritance can sometimes follow strange paths. I remember a few years ago, I was in Athens in the Archaeological Museum, and I took these pictures of a large stele. There is a Roman copy, much more readable in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. But this is the Greek original. First, I believed it was a funeral monument. I believed it was a memorial monument. Indeed, it is not. It is a votive stele, expressing, therefore, a prayer or a wish. It's not memorative, it's desiderative. It represents the young character Triptolemus at the moment when the goddess Demeter bestowed on him the gift, the inheritance, the gift that would make him, Triptolemus, the founder of human culture. This gift is a shaft of wheat, an épi de blé, to be transmitted to Triptolemus, by Triptolemus to all humanity. So he received this seed, and he is able to found agriculture and then culture as such. Behind him, we see Persephone, now returned from Hades, who crowns the child. Triptolemus will also be the founder of the Eleusinian mysteries. Plato, in the Apology of Socrates, affirms that Triptolemus will later become one of the four true judges, by which Plato means the judges of Hades, of the dead. When inheriting the duty to transmit culture, does one thereby receive in addition the task of judging the dead? It's a paradox, and perhaps it's a parable too. Hannah Arendt readers no doubt remember one of her more beautiful and intense texts. I mean the preface she wrote for this book, Between Past and Future, and in French, the book, the title is La crise de la culture, Crisis of Culture. This text bearing the title, The Gap Between Past and Future. This text deals directly with our subject. What do we inherit from the past courage? And what it is for? What this inheritance is for? Everything begins suddenly when Arendt quotes an aphorism from René Char's Les Feuillets d'Hypnose, The Leaves of Hypnose. It's an extraordinary text. René Char wrote, struggling during the French Resistance. He belonged to the French Resistance, and this book is a mixture of military accounts of resistance and extraordinary lyric poems. And Hannah Arendt, who read perfectly, and she spoke French too, quotes this phrase: Notre héritage n'est précédé d'aucun testament. Our heritage left no will. Before our heritage, there was not will at all. We have an heritage, but there was not somebody to say, this is your heritage. It looks like a famous Hasidic parable about the Baal Shem Tov that probably Nodupt, Hannah Arendt, knew very well. It's about the memory which saves, but the memory is always from generation to generation. It reduces. René Char suggests that we cannot always name what we have inherited and from whom we have inherited. Our inheritance is not only made of identifiable data, the données, data. Data much means it's given data. But it's also something which is given and something which is identifiable. No. Not only made out of such identifiable data, nor it is a given that we can figure out or calculate, even if it had indeed been offered to us. Oftentimes, we can neither name our inheritance nor grasp it once and for all. Why is this? For a very simple reason, if you read Freud, for example, because we inherit forgotten things, not only things we can have in memory. We inherit memories, but we inherit forgotten things too. More often than not, we do not even know who left us these gifts. And we do not realize what our treasures are made of. In these circumstances, how could we ever say that we have inherited moments of past courage? We inherit, of course, the gift of life. We result from other people. We share a certain genealogy, or rather, we descend from several intertwined genealogies. For the most part, however, names have been lost along the way. The treasure that was left for us only subsists like erratic blocks, its parts dispersed across the earth, in pieces, fragmented, deformed underneath. Have you inherited the treasure? Okay, look for it over and over, but keep hoping, keep digging. The treasure is not only in your hands, it is elsewhere. The problem is that it cannot be found where you once held it. What you held is but a part of it. The treasure is always larger than anything you could ever hold in your hands. Hannah Arendt writes a very sad statement about the lost treasure of tradition. If we lose tradition, we lose the concept itself of temporality and history. It's a lost treasure. Sadness, even anger in Arendt vocabulary. She understands full well that her own contemporaries, just as it is perhaps the case still today, have no real consciousness of that tradition, she says a tradition, of which they could become the legal heirs if only they would assume responsibility for it. It would be easy to underline the aspects of her thinking that are in close proximity with the idea of the historical melancholy so often expressed by Walter Benjamin. Benjamin, of course, had read Sigmund Freud and Aby Warburg. Thus, he appreciated the importance of the unconscious, the repressed, the return of the repressed, and what Warburg called afterlife, Nachleben. That unique kind of tradition that is more unknown than it is simply hidden. This is a tradition that surfaces in times of crisis, during earthquakes, as symptoms, we have discussed on this term, that show themselves outside of our consciousness and beyond our capacity to identify the treasure of thoughts, of images, of gestures, treasures of acts, of knowledges, of joys, of suffering, treasures that fall to our lot in the present. Notre héritage n'est précédé d'aucun testament. Our heritage left no will. Such a crisis of tradition sounds in Arendt's work a leitmotif that underscores all her thinking in the book Crisis of Culture, or Between the Past and Future. Fortunately, this motif could, under a certain condition, be transformed. This crisis of tradition can be transformed into a critical tradition. Let us speak on Benjamin, but later Adorno, for example. If you do not know what you have inherited, nor from whom you have received it, you should not be afraid. Take courage, for you are able to create for yourselves, for your present and for your future, that what Arendt, at the end of this introduction, named the diagonal force, which is difficult to understand except if you go to a next chapter of the same book, whose title is What is Freedom? And in the concept of freedom, something of the inheritance of memory could be understood. It's a long text, complex, Arendt's philosophical trajectory passes between Plato, Aristotle, Epictetus, St. Augustine, Machiavelli, Kant, Hobbes, Spinoza. Okay. She attempts in this chapter to resolve certain fundamental aporias inherent in the notion of freedom, at least the basic contradiction, very basic, between, on one hand, our conscious declaration that I am free, thanks to my conscience, I am free. On the other, my everyday experience in the outer world, which more often than not subjects my actions to constraints imposed by other persons, police, IDs, I don't know. Referring specifically to Machiavelli, Arendt conceptualizes freedom in terms of virtue. Virtue in virtù in Italian, both an ethical concept, virtù, and ontological potency, virtù, that is potency as such. This is where we find the true diagonal force mentioned above, the true ability to overcome the various gaps that can be so decisive for us. It's a matter of courage, which for Hannah Arendt is obviously one of the first political virtues. So this chapter ends with the concept of courage. But is it a concept? It's more a mysterious virtue. Arendt establishes a radical distinction not only between it and what she calls the lust for power, but also between it, courage, and what she calls sovereignty. Difficult to understand. She says, it's rather difficult to understand how freedom and non-sovereignty can exist together. By the way, it's very linked to the discussion of Zionism at this time in our text. I go on with the quotation. Whatever man may be, it is dangerous to believe that one can be free as an individual or as a group only if one is sovereign. If men wish to be free, it is precisely sovereignty that they must renounce. Yes, it's difficult to understand. Because her particular way of conceptualizing the problem of freedom is linked to the fact that she had always thought in terms of time needing to be fulfilled rather than in terms of spaces needing to be occupied. This is very important if we think about the situation of a ghetto, of course. Courage would therefore be a position one holds over time and within history, not something belonging to a given territory. This is also about nationalism. Courage could provide the necessary bridge when we must pass between the conviction that our heritage left no will and the position that freedom must be constantly reinvented from this heritage. Freedom is thus conceived, she says, as both a faculty of memory and a faculty of beginning. The ability, she says, to make something appear or happen, something that, because of its infinite improbability, interrupts the normal flow of the world. And this is quite a definition of what is an uprising in history. It is infinitely improbable, but it is real. It could happen. And this is a kind of miracle, she says, miracle, in which God is totally extraneous. It's not a question of God, but if she says miracle, I would consider, I would interpret this, because she had decided that she was not a philosopher in the normal sense of the term. She was a theoretician of politics, she said. Why it is anti-philosophical miracle? Because it is anti-conceptual. And what she says here is that courage cannot be linked to a problem of knowledge. Courage is linked to a problem of action. Therefore, there is no concept of courage. And by the way, it is exactly the conclusion you can read in Plato. Plato dedicated a dialogue about courage. The title is The Laches. And significantly, the text concludes with an admission of failure, either to establish a clear knowledge of courage, there is no episteme of courage, or to provide a clear concept of courage, there is no logos of courage. We have not discovered what courage is, Socrates laments to his interlocutor, Nicias, who, while agreeing with Socrates, so we must remember that Socrates, along with Nicias, both are very courageous men because they did the war and they proved that they were courageous. But the conclusion, we don't know what is it exactly. Nicias accepts this conclusion, but he suggests the idea of placing his own children under Socrates' meiotic methods of pedagogy because the most important problem, even if we have not the concept of courage, is something dealing with the transmission. How to inherit courage, even if we don't know what it is exactly. Much later, Michel Foucault will speak on Le courage de la vérité. Cynthia Fleury, other political philosopher in French, speaks about the reinvention of courage as a virtue necessary to democracy. Hannah Arendt, in her own position, did attempt to, she said, re-establish the honor of truth in the face of party lines willing to sacrifice everything in order to reach goals that had been set in the absolute. Hannah Arendt's effort needed an extraordinary political courage because, like the Bundis, she was against everybody, finally. You have just to read the extraordinary collection of his Jewish writings and the famous book on the pariah, the Jewish as a pariah. Between 1941 and 1942, that is before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Hannah Arendt published a series of extraordinary articles in the journal Aufbau in New York, in which she argued for the establishment of a Jewish army, which would take part in the battle against Hitler. She was not speaking of the Palestine army, she was speaking of a European army, and especially a Polish one. For indeed, Arendt was well aware, for other reasons, that the Jewish people was deeply divided by a kind of class struggle, so to speak. And this struggle persisted even when Jews in their entirety as a people found themselves in a so grave peril at the hands of Nazism. And we have saw some images of this. So she was terribly critical against the plutocracy, the government of rich, the Zionist organization. She was terrible. We now understand what she meant when she spoke of active patience as being necessary for combating what she called passive waiting, waiting for a miracle to happen. The first condition consists, according to her, she says, to reinforce self-consciousness. It's a way of speaking about what later Michel Foucault or Judith Butler will call resubjectivation for all the pariah that European Jews had become. Thus, she raved against the right-wing and even fascist tendencies she saw within Zionism itself, as represented by the Irgun militia led precisely by Menachem Begin. This is the Irgun, this is the militia directed by Begin and which was trained by Italian fascists in Civitavecchia. So that when Primo Levi, for example, speaks of Begin as a fascist, Primo Levi was Italian anti-fascist, he knows exactly that Begin trained with Mussolini at Civitavecchia. So for Hannah Arendt, this was a catastrophe. By the way, this organization, the name is Betar, exists still today, and you see the kind of fascistic fashion, so to speak. Okay. Hannah Arendt claimed to the true heritage of the Bible for fighting against this kind of nationalism. And today we have books by some Israeli thinkers. I am speaking, for example, an extraordinary book by Raz Krakotskin. He is an Israeli philosopher, and he wrote a book in French, Exil et Souveraineté. Arendt says the same. She says, we are exile. We are not sovereignty. So I cannot develop more, but just recalling that 1 year after the ghetto uprising, in April 1944, Hannah Arendt wrote a text, an homage to the insurrection. She said, this date marks the anniversary of the beginning of the armed uprising by the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. What the Nazis thought would be a matter of a few hours turned into a great battle that lasted several weeks. What we, in our timidity, were inclined to consider a local outburst of despair turned out to be the beginning of a series of armed revolts in concentration camps and ghettos. I spoke yesterday about some of examples, followed shortly thereafter by the organization of Jewish guerrilla bands with their own Jewish flag. Here, she says, speaks a people momentary avant-garde. The Namenlosen begin to be the avant-garde of whole people. This is a text, the title of which is The Political Organization of Jewish People. The point of view here by Hannah Arendt concerned what was to give historicity back to the Jewish people. give back historicity, that which for the inside, religious conformism had denied the Jews, alongside those forms of political oppression that were becoming more and more ferocious. On the one hand, and I don't resolve the question, but on the one hand, Arendt encouraged the young Jews who had been robbed of any future in Europe to emigrate to Palestine. On the other hand, she denounced the illusion, and she called it an ideology, of the Teshuvah. Teshuvah means return. For, she said, it's presupposed an eternal territorial essence. She said, we must emigrate, but there is no territorial essence. Because if we decrete the territorial essence of Israel, we just return to the ghetto, she says. Considerable intellectual and emotional courage to say this in the 40s. It's amazing. It's like Freud with his book on Moses. It's extremely against the grain, of course. Like her contemporary Walter Benjamin, and even next of kin, Hannah Arendt experienced the gap between past and future with great intensity, both intellectually and politically. She would say so much, some 15 years later, since her own heritage had left no will, she sought to construct a personal wish for a legacy, as well as to imagine her own future, by taking tradition as her point of departure. This would be a hidden tradition, as she was wont to say, a tradition that would enable her to restore historical dignity to that same figure she had earlier called the Jew as pariah. In a text written in 1943, so the same year of the uprising, We Refugees. It's a masterpiece. This text is wonderful. She clearly shows that the Jews of the time were no more than immigrants, refugees, people with no rights, without papers, sans logis, sans papier in French, stateless, homeless. They were even like people who had committed suicide, outlaws, even in death, as she writes in 1944. She is not afraid to shock humanitarian morality when she affirms that it is not by passively accepting the goodwill of associations and benefactors, all too often plutocrats and parvenus coming from the Jewish bourgeoisie, that the dignity of the Jewish people will ever be restored. It's incredibly courageous to say this because they needed for such benefactors. But she says the problem of dignity must be at stake. But for that restoration of dignity to occur, it is not enough to call upon a tradition. It's also necessary, if we want to go beyond this gap between past and future, to, she says, politicize that tradition and historicize that tradition. We thereby arm ourselves with an essential dialectic tool. And this dialectic tool, sorry to come back to my obsessions, Benjamin called an image, dialectical image. Here, the image is understood as a fruit-bearing collision between memories past and the present moment's desire for emancipation. The text by Hannah Arendt now belongs to a publication made by the Documenta, the Kassel Documenta, and it's very good that this text was republished along with, for example, among other examples, this film by two Greek artists, Niki Giannari and Maria Curcuta, two Greek artists who did an extraordinary film on the frontier between Greece and Macedonia in the Idomeni camp last year in March 2016. Thank you.